It was Lucas' birthday. The smile on his mother's face was unmistakable, as always. She made sure to do everything she could to make his day perfect. "Happy birthday, my love," she said, placing a carefully wrapped gift in front of Lucas. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he eagerly tore open the paper. Inside the box was a rag doll. It wasn't big, but it had a peculiar expression. A stitched smile that looked almost forced, and two small, shiny eyes that seemed to observe more than just being part of a toy. Lucas wasn't sure what to think. The doll was made from thick fabric in vibrant colors, with yarn hair that looked handmade with care. But despite its colorful and friendly appearance, something about it felt off. "Where did it come from, Mom?" Lucas asked, still holding the doll in his hands, examining it closely. His mother smiled, not noticing the unease in her son's eyes. "From a distant relative, sweetie. They saw how much you like toys like this and thought they'd give you something special. I think you're going to like it." Lucas shook his head, still unsure of what to make of it. His young, imaginative mind, at just 9 years old, started to wonder if maybe the doll was magical. Perhaps it had something special about it. But the strange feeling, which began to creep in as soon as he grabbed the doll, couldn't be ignored. For a moment, the house felt colder. Lucas' old toys scattered on the floor now seemed too ordinary. The rag doll, however, stood out. It was there in his hands, and its eyes seemed to gleam with a life of their own. "Maybe it's just my imagination," Lucas thought, trying to shake off the discomfort that was settling over him. He placed the doll next to his bed on the nightstand and went to play with other toys, but something strange lingered in the air. No matter how hard he tried to focus on something else, he couldn't stop glancing at the doll. The stitched smile seemed a little bigger now, as if it was silently watching him, waiting. "I'll call him Tobias," Lucas whispered to himself, trying to find some comfort in the name. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize the situation, the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. Night fell silently, as if the house had been swallowed by the darkness. Lucas was in his room, lying on his bed, eyes glued to the TV, but something was bothering him. The rag doll, Tobias, was still there on the nightstand, with that forced smile in the small, shiny eyes. Lucas tried to distract himself with a cartoon, but couldn't stop casting a furtive glance at the doll. Something wasn't right. Every now and then, he would quickly glance at the table, checking if the doll was still where he had left it. And yes, there was still unmoving, just as it should be. But when Lucas finally got up to go to the bathroom, something stopped him at the door. He looked at the table, and to his surprise, Tobias was no longer there. In an instinctive move, his heart skipped a beat, and his eyes frantically searched the room. The doll was on the floor, lying on its back, its head facing the bed. I didn't put him on the floor," Lucas muttered, confused and scared. He approached the doll, and with his breath quickening, he picked Tobias up. The doll felt even colder now, and the smile seemed more pronounced. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. But how could the doll have moved on its own? Lucas felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he tried to push the thought away. "Maybe I did it by accident," he thought, trying to rationalize. But as he placed Tobias back on the nightstand, an unsettling feeling of discomfort lingered, as if the doll was waiting. The night went on, and later, Lucas went to bed, but the unease only grew. He pulled the covers over his head, but couldn't fall asleep. With every shadow that moved in the room, he felt Tobias' eyes on him. The fixed smile, as if the doll was there, watching him closely. Suddenly, a disturbing thought crossed his mind. What if the doll was really watching me? He forced his eyes shut, trying not to think about it. until sleep finally overtook him. But what he didn't know was that night, something else would happen. When Lucas woke up the next morning, the room was still silent. He stretched and slowly opened his eyes. What he saw immediately made his heart race. Tobias was no longer on the nightstand. The doll was now sitting in the chair beside the bed, its hands resting on its knees and its head slightly tilted forward. The doll's expression seemed more intense, more alive. Lucas swallowed hard, his mind in a whirl. I definitely didn't put him there, he thought, a chill running down his spine. What was happening? Why was the doll moving on its own? Lucas was paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the rag doll now sitting in the chair, staring at him. The doll's smile seemed to have widened, becoming even more unsettling, and the button eyes glowed with an intensity that made the boy question his own sanity. His chest tightened with growing fear. He knew he hadn't moved Tobias. He hadn't touched the doll since the night before. The silence of the room was broken only by the sound of his breathing, which quickened. He slowly got up, trying to stay calm, and walked over to the chair where Tobias was sitting. His sweaty hands, heart pounding, Lucas touched the doll. The sensation was instant. Tobias was freezing, as if it had been frozen for hours. But the strangest thing was the softness of the touch, which didn't feel like a rag doll at all, but something more real, more solid. He quickly withdrew his hand, a chill running up his spine. Something was definitely wrong. Tobias wasn't an ordinary toy. He was something else. Something Lucas couldn't understand. I need to talk to my mom, Lucas muttered to himself, but then quickly corrected himself, trying to push the thought away. She won't believe this. I don't even know how to explain it. The doll seemed lifeless, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Lucas felt as though every move he made was being carefully observed by Tobias. It was such a disturbing sensation that he couldn't stay calm in his own room anymore. He decided to leave the doll where it was and go to the living room. But as he moved away, the sound of something being dragged on the floor made Lucas stop. He turned around quickly, his eyes searching in panic around the room. Tobias had moved. The doll was now by the bedroom door, facing away, with its hands on its shoulders, as if trying to peer through the crack. Lucas felt a sudden cold take over his body. He was sure he had left the doll in the chair. How was this possible? He ran to the door and slammed it shut quickly, as if doing so would somehow protect his mind from the madness that was starting to take over his thoughts. Throughout the day, Lucas's unease only grew. Tobias was everywhere, sometimes in the living room, other times in the hallway, even in the kitchen, with that same sinister expression, always in positions he hadn't left him in. No matter what he did, the doll would appear somewhere else, as if it was stalking him. And the closer night came, the stronger the feeling grew that the doll was getting closer to him. Finally, exhausted and overwhelmed with desperation, Lucas couldn't take it anymore. I need to get rid of him, he thought, but he didn't know how. What would happen if he just threw him away? Or hit him? Nothing seemed like a real solution. That night, when the lights were off and silence had settled over the house, Lucas turned to the corner of his room, where the doll was still sitting, its eyes glowing like headlights in the dark. He could no longer face those eyes. The doll seemed to have a life of its own will. With a heavy sigh, Lucas got out of bed and, heart pounding, picked up the doll with trembling hands. He ran to the door and, driven by a mix of anger and fear, threw Tobias out of the house. But before closing the door, Lucas felt something strange. The wind didn't move the doll. Tobias lay there, but his eyes still seemed fixed on the house, directed at the window of the room. Lucas swallowed hard. He could swear that, even outside, the doll was still watching him. Out of breath, he finally closed the door and crawled into bed. But even under the covers, He couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if the doll came back. Lucas barely managed to sleep that night. The anxiety kept him awake, his eyes wide open in the dark, his mind fixed on the doll. He knew somehow Tobias was still watching him, and that was enough to keep him on edge, his heart racing at every noise in the house. At dawn, the weak sunlight filtered through the window, and Lucas, with tired eyes, tried to convince himself that it had all been just a nightmare. I threw the doll away, he thought, trying to calm down. It'll be fine. There's no way it could come back. But when he went downstairs, his stomach twisted. That smell. It was sweet, but also sour, like a damp, old cloth. Lucas followed the scent into the living room, and what he saw made his heart stop for a second. Tobias was there, in the middle of the room, with the widest smile Lucas had ever seen. He was lying down, but now the doll's eyes were completely turned toward the ceiling, fixed, as if it were watching everything with terrifying intensity. Its little buttons, which once seemed simple, now seemed to absorb the light in the room, as if they were alive. Lucas shuddered. He was certain he had thrown the doll out of the house. How had it come back? It was impossible. He looked around, searching for some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The door was closed, the windows too. Tobias was back, but that wasn't all. The feeling of being watched was even stronger. It was as if the doll had found a way to get back in. And now, it was there, waiting. Panic gripped Lucas. I need to leave. I need to get out of this house, he thought, as his feet seemed to grow heavier with each step. But he knew he couldn't just leave everything behind. Something was wrong, and he couldn't ignore it. At that moment, he made an impulsive decision. He was going to destroy the doll. If he burned it or tore it apart, maybe that would end the connection. But as he approached Tobias, something even stranger happened. The doll moved. With a slow motion, Tobias lifted himself from the position he had been in, as if stretching. The button eyes glowed even more intensely, and the smile, which had once seemed like a simple stitch, now looked like a symbol of malice. It was as if the doll had a life of its own, and it was smiling. Lucas recoiled, but his feet felt glued to the floor, as if the house itself was now controlling his movements. He felt a cold chill run down his spine. Tobias was approaching him slowly, as if he knew Lucas couldn't escape. In a panic, Lucas grabbed the doll, rushing toward the front door. But when he opened the door, he found his worst nightmare. The street was empty. No one was around, but as he looked to the side, he saw a shadow moving near the tree in the yard. The doll had a connection to him, and Lucas was starting to realize there was no way out. Tobias was everywhere. He was inside him, in the house, in his mind. The doll was no longer just a toy. It was a specter, something much older and more powerful. And now, the bond between them was only growing stronger. The feeling of being followed had never been so intense. Even in the middle of the daylight, Lucas could feel Tobias's shadow as a threatening presence, an entity that was watching him closely. He looked at the empty street, where the cold breeze rustled the leaves on the trees, but there was no longer any sense of security. The walls of his house felt, somehow, closer, tighter, as if they were closing in on him. With the doll still in his hands, Lucas knew he couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. Tobias wasn't just a toy. He was something that had been awakened, something that had attached itself to him like a parasite, and he was beginning to understand that maybe the doll was just the beginning. The shadow by the tree moved again, now clearer. Lucas knew that the feeling of being watched wasn't just his imagination. Something was out there, waiting for him. The unease he felt made him tremble, but he couldn't delay the truth any longer. Tobias was outside, and he was no longer just a rag doll. In a desperate impulse, Lucas rushed back inside and locked the door. He didn't know where else to run, but somewhere deep inside, he knew there was no escaping this presence. The doll in his hands felt heavier, and a strange pressure began to grow in his chest, as if Tobias's weight was crushing him. He looked at the object in his hands, its button eyes now looking more vivid, more alive. The smile once simple, was now widening, stretching farther than Lucas could fathom. He no longer had the strength to fight it. Without thinking, Lucas hurled the doll into the blazing fireplace. The flames quickly began to consume the fabric, but instead of burning the way it should have, Tobias seemed to resist. The doll didn't burn as expected. Instead, it emitted a strange sound, as if it were whispering, murmuring incomprehensible words. "No," Lucas murmured, but the words died in his throat as the fire intensified, as if the doll was feeding the flames. When the flames started to engulf Tobias completely, Lucas felt an unbearable chill. He wasn't alone. When he looked at the mirror in the room, a shadow appeared behind him. A figure, dark and distorted, seemed to have formed from the smoke of the fireplace. Lucas tried to step back, but his feet felt heavy, and the shadow was swallowing him. He looked back at the fire, where the doll had disappeared. But the feeling of Tobias, his presence, hadn't gone away. On the contrary, it was getting stronger. He felt something cold and damp touching his neck, and when he turned around, he saw that the shadow which had formed wasn't reflected in the mirror anymore. It was right there in front of him, on the floor of the room. With a muffled scream, Lucas fell back, dragging himself away from the entity. But something was pulling him toward the center of the room, as if invisible hands were holding him. The doll was no longer just in the house. It was in the air itself, in the essence of the place, wrapping around him in an indescribable way. And somehow, Lucas knew that as long as the doll wasn't completely destroyed, he would be trapped. There was no escaping Tobias anymore. The rag doll, now, was a presence that would follow him until the end, and he didn't know if there was anything that could stop it. The walls of the house seemed to curve around Lucas. He knew he was running out of options, that Tobias's presence was only intensifying. The doll was no longer a toy, no longer something that could be ignored or forgotten. It was an evil that had become embedded in the very soul of the house, in the darkest corners and the invisible cracks between the walls. Lucas tried to move through the house, but his legs felt heavy, as though he was carrying an invisible burden, a weight of pure terror. With every step, the sound of fabric rubbing against the floor echoed, mixed with the sound of his labored breathing. The house was silent, except for the constant whisper, as though something was always there, following his movements. When nightfall came, the fear Lucas felt turned into something darker. The house was cold, but there was something beyond the physical cold, something icy that took over his mind. He closed the doors and windows, but it made no difference. Tobias was everywhere. He could feel him in the air, in the corners of the house, in the darkness that spread like poison. With every passing moment, the presence of the doll seemed to grow stronger. Lucas heard the sound of soft footsteps behind him, as if someone was walking, but when he turned, no one was there. The feeling of being watched grew so intense that he could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. He didn't know who to trust anymore. When he looked in the mirror again, he didn't just see his reflection. There was something else, something moving, distorting the glass. It was Tobias, but not the doll he knew. It was a version of him that seemed to materialize directly from a nightmare. "You can't escape me." Tobias's button eyes glowed intensely through the reflection. The voice was a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in his mind. "I'm everywhere. You can't run from me." Lucas tried to scream, but his throat closed, swallowing the sound. The terror was becoming unbearable, as though his very mind was being devoured by the creature. The doll, with its button eyes, now seemed to have a will of its own, an intelligence that defied everything he knew about the world. With no strength left to resist, Lucas ran to the basement, where he locked himself in. He sat on the cold floor and, for a brief moment, tried to calm himself. But the house wouldn't stop whispering. The walls moved, the shadows danced, and Tobias was there everywhere. The doll had become a force that surpassed the physical limits of the house. It was no longer just an object. And then the basement door opened. With a sinister creak, the door moved by itself, and Lucas felt a cold, dense presence approaching. Tobias was there, standing in the doorway, with that unsettling smile that seemed to mock his desperate attempt to escape. The doll didn't need hands to hold the door. It was beyond that now, closer to the darkness. Tobias's voice echoed once more, not from the outside, but inside Lucas's very mind. "You're mine now. I am the darkness you can no longer avoid." Lucas looked at the doll, and in that moment, he knew there was no more fight left. He had been consumed by the supernatural presence that the doll had brought. The night was only just beginning, and with it, Tobias's true face would be revealed. The doll was no longer something that moved. It was a very darkness now, devouring everything around it. The house, Lucas's body, the very world, were slowly being overtaken. And then, in the silence of the night, Lucas disappeared. Lucas woke up in a strange place. His vision was blurred and the air was thick, heavy with the smell of mold and despair. He tried to move but couldn't. He was lying down but not on a bed. The ground beneath him was cold, hard, and covered with something he couldn't identify. When he finally managed to open his eyes, he realized he was in a dark place, with no windows, no doors, a space that had no limits. Only darkness around him. He tried to scream, but his voice didn't come out. The terror now took on a new form, deeper, more terrifying. Tobias was there, in the darkness, a presence stronger than ever. And even though the doll wasn't physically present, Lucas felt its presence as if it were part of the air he breathed, something that was rooted inside him, in his soul. "You're never going to escape me again," Tobias's voice echoed in Lucas's head. It was more of an order than a threat, a complete certainty that there was no way out for him anymore. Lucas tried to remember how he got here, how this nightmare began. He recalled the house, the basement door, the darkness spreading. But now, everything was different. Tobias was no longer hiding in the shadows. He was the darkness. He was everything. "I am your prison, Lucas," the voice said, like a whisper sneaking into the deepest corners of his mind. "I am the fear you carry, the terror you can't control. And now, you're mine, forever." Lucas didn't know what to do anymore. Time, space, and even reality itself seemed to lose their meaning. He tried to fight, to remember something, anything, but he was trapped, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually. Tobias had become the only thing that existed. And then he felt it, a growing pressure, a stronger presence, seeping into his thoughts, taking over his mind. The darkness was becoming solid, as if it stretched beyond what he could see. He tried to scream again, but no sound came. There was nothing left. "Now, Lucas." Tobias's voice was the last thing he heard. "You understand, don't you? You're part of me. I am you." The next moment, everything was wiped away. There was no more Lucas. There was nothing but Tobias. He had consumed the mind, the soul, and the body of his target. And with that, the cycle was complete. Tobias was no longer just a rag doll. He was no longer a simple object. He was now a being, an entity, and his presence would spread beyond the house, beyond the reality everyone knew. Who would be next?